Hello, today I'm going to talk about Linux versus Windows versus Mac OS. Currently, I use almost exclusively Fedora Linux, but I have used MacBook Pro for a long time, and also at work I use Windows. So I'm going to talk about these three operating systems. So first, Windows. It's definitely have the broadest user base by far. Yeah. The vast majority of consumer use Windows, and there are a lot of hardware drivers. If you build some hardware, say a Wi-Fi adapter, of course you will want to make Windows driver because that's the most number of computers out there. So if you want to sell your stuff, you have to make Windows driver. This is not true for Linux. Okay, lots of games. Windows subsystems for Linux allows you to run some Linux style bash command under Windows, which is pretty nice because the interpreters come with Windows, the PowerShell and the command prompt. They are not as good as, in my opinion, not as good as a Linux bash. So basically this thing allows you to write some scripts very conveniently. There are also lots of software, but the downside is that these software are usually not free. Okay, another benefit is that Windows desktops are easy to upgrade. You can buy a Dell computer and you find out, oh, some components are crappy, you want to replace it. You can easily buy some hardware and replace your, say, Wi-Fi card or hard drive or anything. And also the low-cost peripherals is a huge advantage. If you buy a mouse, buy a keyboard, usually they are much cheaper than a mouse and keyboard for, say, a MacBook. Yeah. And you have lots of choices. You can buy from Lenovo, from HP, from Dell, from, say, some other companies like Asus. There are lots of choices compared to MacBooks. So these are the Windows pros. Now the cons. The proprietary software usually costs money, so they are not free. And if you want to upgrade it, sometimes you have to pay more. Yeah, or you pay money in the software as a service to subscribe to certain software. They all cost money, and it's not as secure or reliable as Linux. Windows upgrades usually ridiculous, like you have 1%, 2%, please reboot your computer. I mean, it's kind of silly. If you use Linux, you know it's kind of silly. Linux upgrades are very smooth, and a lot of times you don't have to reboot your computer. Also, the user interface is pretty nice. Windows 10, I think, is pretty nice, but it's not as customizable as Linux. For example, I'm using Linux Fedora. I have programmed hotkeys to launch certain programs, like the Fire Explorer. You just press Super and E to launch the terminal, Control Alt T to launch the software I use the most, the Visual Studio Code, Windows plus the C key. If you want to launch the browser, the Windows key and B. So you can customize your user interface in Linux very freely and assign hotkeys, but it's not as easy in Windows. Okay, generally the Windows is inferior in performance compared to Linux, especially for older computers. There are tons of bloatware running in the background, making the computer slower and slower. That's a big problem. Okay, Mac OS. I used a MacBook for a long time, and MacBook Pro. I think it's a very good piece of hardware, very high quality. So one big advantage of Mac OS, the Apple computer, is that it's guaranteed compatibility between hardware and software because they are made by the same company, obviously. If the hardware doesn't have compatibility with the Mac OS, the Apple simply wouldn't use it. So guaranteed compatibility, and also generally high quality components. Given the price, if you buy a MacBook and you find out the interior, they use some crappy components like Dell, you probably will be pissed off. So generally, given the price, the components are of high quality. Also, there's this kind of Mac design, Mac aesthetics. If you like it, you're into it, yeah, you can spend more money for that kind of design. Also, the software are generally very good, and also there's good mobile integration, like your cell phone and stuff you can plug into your MacBook. There's nice integration, if you use, of course, other Apple products. And also you can run Windows and Linux from MacBook, which is a pro, yeah. And the there are a lot of obvious lots of Apple stores, and you can find good customer support, which is a huge advantage. Yeah. Okay, some disadvantages. They are very, very expensive, the MacBooks. Same hardware specs, they are much more expensive than comparable PCs. Also, there are limited model choices because Apple is just one company. They make these models, and that's what you use. Unlike PC, you can buy from Dell, Lenovo, you can buy from HP or some other companies like Asus. So you have lots more choices. And the peripherals are usually expensive and limited. For a computer PC, you can buy whichever brand of, say, Logitech mouse, keyboard. They are usually very cheap, but the counterpart for Apple is much more expensive. Also, there are fewer software than Windows for sure, fewer games. It's also difficult to upgrade. Yeah, the software and the hardware they put together works pretty well, but if you want to replace something, it's generally very difficult. You're stuck. Unlike a PC, a desktop, you can upgrade a lot of stuff if the motherboard is good enough. You can upgrade your hard drive, upgrade your RAM, upgrade your CPU, and the PC can run for many, many years. Okay, let's talk about Linux. As I mentioned earlier, I use almost exclusively Linux. Currently, I'm making this video on Fedora Linux version 31, Fedora 31. I think it's by far the most widely used operating system in the world. It's not for personal computers, but for the computers running in, say, at the cashier of a store, on the aircraft. The Chromebook runs Google Chrome. It's based on Linux, so it's by far the most widely used operating system. And also it's free, and there are lots of free open source software, and some of them actually beats their Windows counterpart, like the software I'm using now called Vocal Screen. I can use it to record my screen. It's very convenient. And Linux is generally considered very safe, secure, and reliable. Also, the upgrade process is very smooth. You have package managers, you download the stuff, you don't have to reboot most of the time. Yeah, it's very, very easy to upgrade. And also, there are lots of distros to choose from. This can be a con as well, because there are too many choices. Sometimes you just waste a lot of time testing different distros. So basically, the distro just to have different software bundled with the same Linux kernel. The kernel is the innermost part of the software operating system, but you can bundle it with different desktop environments, different software. So these are the different distros you can choose from. So the one I'm using now is called Fedora. Other distros, popular ones like Ubuntu, there's Arch Linux. There's also something derived from Arch Linux called Manjaro. I think it's very popular these days. Okay, there's also highly customizable user interface. Like I mentioned earlier, you can just assign hotkeys. I can put the dock at the bottom, make the terminals half transparent. All these things I can do with the Linux. Also, there's great community support. If you have questions, you can ask at a board, and usually people are very, very well. They're knowledgeable. They are willing to help you. So the cons. This is really for tech-savvy users. You need to use a terminal to write some code to get things done a lot of times. If you don't understand a computer much, and I read from YouTube, some guy spent like 4 days trying to install a video card driver. Well, if you do not want to learn about computers, you do not want to write any code, Linux is definitely not for you. Your experience can be extremely frustrating. So stay away from Linux if you do not want to learn about computers. Also, you have to rely on self-support most of the time. If you encounter problems, the Microsoft is not going to help you. These are free software, right? Also, there's limited hardware drivers. That's not a con of Linux itself, but rather because of the smaller user base. For example, my Lenovo ThinkPad Carbon X1, the laptop I use, the fingerprint reader doesn't work under Linux because the manufacturer didn't produce Linux driver, so there's nothing you can do about it. So when you want to install Linux on a desktop, chances are it will work. But if you want to install Linux on a laptop, you need to be very careful. Make sure most of the hardware is compatible with Linux. Based on my experience, the Lenovo ThinkPad series are very good choice. And I know some Dell computers, Dell laptops are pre-installed with Linux, so make sure you do your research. Okay, limited games. Like if you want to play video games, certain titles can run under Linux, like the one I played, like Shadow of Mordor. There's also the Tomb Raider. Yeah, they work pretty well under Linux, but a lot of other games do not have Linux version because the smaller user base. Yeah, the developers simply don't want to create a Linux version. So when you use Linux, you better dual boot, because if you want to play video games, if you want to use certain hardware like the GoPro, you have to use the software under Windows because there's no Linux software. So it's best for dual boot. Overall, I would say Linux is the vastly superior operating system. It's so smooth, so easy to use, no hiccups. I would strongly recommend Linux, but not for non-tech savvy people. Yeah, if you just want to get your stuff done, there's no need to torture yourself by writing some code. Yeah, this is not necessary. Okay, that's my talk. Thank you.